Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry. And we are talking tonight about 3 highly effective strategies that you can use when teaching science and social studies to a split grade. And we're also going to talk about 3 strategies that you might want to avoid. So thank you so much for joining me. My name is Patty, and I am a 4-5 junior grade teacher here in Ontario, Canada. And I have live videos every single Monday night where we talk all things using inquiry-based teaching, as well as universal design, and all things related to those topics in your classroom. It is my goal that through these videos, I can help you to push your thinking as a teacher, to try different things, to make sure that learning is both fun and engaging for both you and your students. So thank you so much for joining me, and let's get started. So again, tonight we're talking about 3 highly effective strategies for teaching science and social studies to a split grade class in particular. So let's look at what's the big deal anyways. Why is this such a problem for so many teachers? And it seems to be a huge stressor for a lot of people when they are assigned to teach a split grade, is how exactly do you teach science and social studies, which are 2 very distinct subject matters for a split grade classroom. How exactly do you teach 2 grades at the same time? So we're going to discover. So what is the problem with that? The biggest one is the fact that you're teaching 2 grades at once. It means you could have problems with the fact that students are struggling to manage independent work time. Because science and social studies are 2 completely different things, there is very little overlap often between those 2 subject areas. Unlike math and language, art, drama, and pretty much every other subject, which is much more easily integrated, science and social studies does tend to be much more difficult because the topics that are being discussed at each grade level are so different. It also means that because you're teaching 2 grades at once, you also have double the prep and planning that is required because you're teaching 2 separate subject matters in the exact same allotment of time. And everything takes a little bit longer when you're teaching science and social studies, and in fact, everything to a split grade. So who am I and why am I talking to you about this? Well, I've been teaching in my current classroom for about the last 8 years. And prior to that, I was doing other things in other schools. But in this particular school, I have the honor or privilege or consequence, if you might look at it, with almost every single year teaching a split grade 4-5 classroom. So I have had to adapt to teaching in a split grade setting almost every single year. For the first time, I actually have a straight grade this year, but I can tell you I'm actually finding it to be a bit more challenging than I have teaching the split. So there are some things that you can do, and there are definitely some benefits of teaching in a split grade learning environment over teaching in a straight grade learning environment. So coming to you with that perspective and being able to share with you some of the ideas that I have been using in my own class, teaching a split year after year after year, and explaining those high yield strategies that are going to allow me to teach subjects like science and social studies to the same group of students at different times, and allowing me to get through all of the required material in the same amount of time takes a little bit of maneuvering, but it totally can be done. And that's why I wanted to come on here tonight and talk about the strategies that I find most effective to teaching those 2 subjects to split grade classrooms. So what am I going to be talking to you about today? Well, I want to go over the 3 highly effective strategies for teaching science and social studies to a split grade classroom. I also want to talk about the common strategies that I think you should avoid and that often may set you up for failure long term. And I also want to talk to you about how to implement these 3 effective strategies in your classroom with some practical ideas. So strategy 1, this is what I want you to avoid. Oftentimes, students with a split grade will say it's much easier if I teach all of the content for both grades to all of my students at the same time, which means you would teach, say you're teaching a grade 4 or 5, you would teach all of the grade 4 content and all of the grade 5 content to your entire class, regardless of what grade they happen to be in. Why do I think you should avoid this? Number one, you might not have the time to actually get through all of that content. If you look at what exactly you're supposed to get covered, not only are you already time pressed if you're in a straight grade to get all of the science and social studies done and finished by the end of the year, but now you're going to double that content and take twice as long to do it. Instead of teaching the grade 4s their grade 4 content and the grade 5s their grade 5 content, you teach all the grade 4 content and all the grade 5 content. It's actually going to take you way more time. I would be hard pressed as it is to get through all of that content in the 194 teaching days. So you simply just don't have enough time to do a great job at much when you're trying to do twice as much work or even quadruple the amount of work that you would if you had, say, a straight grade. It also means that if you're going to use this type of method where you're teaching all of the content to both grades at the same time, it's really repetitive. Either your older grade has already covered that content and they're bored, and bored students create a management problem, or you have lots and lots of overlap, which is going to set up those students for perhaps a disadvantage next year because they've already learned that content. So many of us don't actually teach the same students the next year, so we don't have to are not the beneficiaries of that struggle. However, students need to be learning the content of their grade level at the time that they're in that grade level. Now, there are some schools that are always split, that end up swapping which content they teach. So 1 year they'll teach all the grade 4 content, 1 year they teach all the grade 5 content. For me, I think that's a little bit different. If you're in a situation like that, which I know is few and far between, then that may be the best idea because you're not repeating content because you have a negotiation with the rest of the teaching staff that 1 year you teach one content, 1 year you teach the other. The problem is if you have a really transient community in your classroom, that those students that are coming in and going out are going to miss the specific grade level content if they're transitioning schools. So it's a very specific circumstance in which this flip-flop year to year as a whole school might actually benefit and work for your students. So instead of teaching all of the content to the same students at the same time, you can instead try using a teach then split method. Now this is instead of looking at doubling up your content, so teach all of your students, say habitats, and then all of your students human body. Instead, focus on the activity that your students are going to be doing and have both grades do the same activity at the same time while using different content. So for example, you could use a read and respond where all students are reading an article and then they are responding, except the article that the grade level is reading is going to be different from the other grade level in your classroom, but the activity is the same. So you can talk to students about your expectations and teach them what you want them to be doing. Okay, grade 4s, I want you to be reading this article and then you're going to respond to these questions. You can even make it so that the questions are the same and you review your expectations. But when you send them off to do the work, they're all doing independent tasks at the same time so that you're available to manage that. But the task they're doing is going to be differentiated based on what grade they happen to be in. You could also use activities such as make and takes, where you are talking about making something and they're using content that they are aware of, and then they go and independently make it. So this is something like a game board, where if you're asking them to make a game board, your entire class could be making a game board as a review activity, but the content of their game board is going to be different depending on what subject matter they happen to be focusing on. Same with an interactive notebook. This is something where they're going to kind of do as a reflection or review, and it's often they're cutting and pasting and assembling. Both grades can be doing this at the same time. However, what they're creating is going to be different. So the activity is the focus on what it is they're doing so that all students are doing the same activity at the same time, but the content of that activity is going to be different depending on what grade it is they're working on. This is ideal if you are teaching in a situation where your students are really struggling with independent work time, where you want their independent work time to all be at the same time, but you want necessarily the content of what they're doing to be different. Strategy number 2 that I think you should avoid is sending them away to another class. Now, this is often considered the easiest solution, and unless you're looking at a split grade where you only have 3 or 4 students of one grade and the remainder of your class is a second grade, so if you have 3 or 4 grade 4s and 25 grade 5s, in that circumstance, it might actually be beneficial to have your grade 4s go learn with another group of grade 4s at the same time, because it's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation with 4 ideas. So you want to have a bit of a larger group. So if you have 6 or more students in one of your grades, I would avoid sending them to another classroom. Now, the biggest reason for that is the ability to use cross-strand integration. Science and social studies heavily relies on the skills that are taught in other subjects, such as language or even math. When you are sending some students away and keeping other students, it very much limits your ability to support what they need to do in science and social studies in other subjects. So if I want my students to be able to read and respond, that's definitely a language activity that I can be using and teaching in my language activity where students are integrated in this, what they're learning. They're learning the same thing at the same time in language. And then they can do that type of activity in science and social studies. Independent work has to be work that students are very familiar with and know exactly what the expectations are. Allowing me to teach them how to do something in language and then applying that, having them do it in science and social studies independently, helps to support their ability to work independently in science and social studies. Without that, students struggle a lot more with engaging in a brand new activity that they don't have any experience doing. So if you haven't built up their stamina to do that in language, it's much more difficult for them to actually do that effectively independently during science and social studies. It also means that you have to end up doing more in the same time because you've got to build in some of that background. You've got to teach them how to do a read and respond. You've got to teach them how to take notes. You have to teach them how to sit and have a conversation because you don't have that at the same time. So those students, when they go to that other classroom, are going to be missing some of that component that you can cross-integrate and even build stamina in other subjects and apply it to using it in science and social studies. Sending students off for another class as well, it means that you have far less flexibility when working within science and social studies. In a split, one of the best assets you have is the ability to be flexible, which means if you need something to take longer than a 15-minute period, you can do that because you can take from another subject, extend your learning, swap things around, move things based on student need. It's much more difficult to do that if you are rigidly structured in when science happens. Science, when you're teaching your whole split, science can happen whenever you have time to have science. Science can happen when another grade is working on another topic. So instead of sending students away, if you've got a group of 6 or more students in one grade, that's enough to keep them with you. And instead, try open learning. Now, open learning means that just because it says science on your schedule doesn't mean that every student is necessarily engaged in a science activity. In fact, it might be beneficial for instead of your grade 4s to be working on science with you, well, your grade 5s are completing an activity from another subject that you know they can do independently, such as art or writing or reading and responding. What you do want to avoid in this circumstance is simply just giving them busy work to keep them quiet. It never keeps them quiet. They see right through it, and management is really, really difficult. So you have to find that sweet spot in the independent work where it's something that they are highly engaged in, something that they are familiar with doing, so it's not something new that they're working on. They know what it looks like, they know how to do it, but it also has to be meaningful and rigorous so that the students aren't just simply realizing that this is a coloring activity and I don't need to do it, or this is a reading activity and I'm simply just sitting there staring at the pages because I'm not a strong reader. It needs to be something that your students can do independently, but try to pull from another subject. So if they can't engage in science independently while you're teaching one group and the other group cannot do a science activity, why not try an activity from another subject that they are able to do more independently, such as art? They can also work on math practice or even spelling and grammar activities at that same time. Strategy 3. This is the one and done activities like centers or even guest speakers, or even a field trip for that matter. Learning an entire subject of science and social studies in a one-off or 1 to 3 day activity is simply not enough for them to consolidate their learning and have it being meaningful. So you want to do more than simply just one round of centers and hopefully hit on all of the topics and say, okay, I'm done, let's move on to the next activity. You want to spend a little bit more time getting into the learning. You want to have a variety of learning experiences. Centers are definitely one activity you can do, but you want to make sure that you have a variety of hands-on activities as well as pencil and paper and centers, and a variety so that students can have lots of different ways to integrate that knowledge into their schema. Sometimes different centers activities are not rigorous enough, or the teacher needs to be far more involved in learning, or you need to make sure that these simple centers are not necessarily complete solutions, so they don't cover all of your learning topics. So instead of doing one and done type teaching, try a flip-flop method. Now this happens to be my absolute favorite strategy for teaching students science and social studies, is using this flip-flop method. This means that one grade is with you, engaged in a teacher-directed activity, while the other grade is working independently but still on science. So, or social studies, or whatever topic you happen to be working on. But it's still very much both grades are engaged in subject-specific learning, but one grade is with you and the other grade is engaged in independent activity that they can do without your support, which often means this other independent activity needs to be actually at their independent level. It needs to be simple enough and something that they're familiar with. Now, often an objection that happens with the flip-flop method is that my students are not independent workers. Really evaluate what activity you're asking them to do independently. Often, if the activity is too difficult, then they are going to have a very difficult time doing that independently. It has to be something they've done before. It has to be something that they can do below their independent level, so it has to be a little bit easier than what they would typically do with you. You also have a often objection of, how do I know what they are doing, what they're supposed to do? There has to be some checks and balances that you put in place with the flip-flop method that hold students accountable for completing the assigned task during independent work time. You may not need to be on top of them all of the time making sure work is getting done, but you do need to have a system in place that allows you to follow up on that learning to ensure that students are getting through the learning. And this could be a reflection activity after the independent learning where they share what they learned. It could be a quick exit card, or it could simply be you collecting and checking that the work was completed as you had assigned it. So when you're using the flip-flop method, try to look at the two different types of tasks that you have going on in your classroom. One are far more rich because they're with you and you can do a lot more teacher directed led. You can even facilitate lots of inquiry through here and help to guide your students along that path because they're with you. One of the biggest benefits of having a split grade class is you have smaller numbers with you. So instead of 1 to 30 having a whole discussion, you could be having a discussion with 1 to 15, which means you can have a much more intimate discussion with that split grade, and while the other students are working on something else. So sometimes those conversations are a little bit easier to manage, and you can get a lot more voices heard because they're not trying to compete with 1 to 30, it's 1 to 15. So there's more opportunities in a split grade for each individual students to voice their ideas and opinions in that smaller half group of students. So try for your teacher-directed activities, knowledge building circles, experiments. You want to introduce new activities and new learning here with the teacher-directed support. You also want to do that accountability piece where you're asking them to reflect on something they did independently or to consolidate some of their learning. And you also could be doing an interactive activity. One of my favorites is doing the human heart activity where I set up bean bags and hula hoops on my carpet and students jump through like their blood cells, and they jump through the 4 chambers of the heart, dropping off old blood or white blood cells and red blood cells. So that's an interactive activity that I definitely wouldn't be asking my students to do independently, but it is something I'm going to ask that they're going to do while with me. And it's not exactly an experiment, but definitely a really fun, engaging activity that students can participate in. But on the flip side, you have the other grade, and what are they doing at the same time? They're going to be doing an activity that does not require a lot of movement, and it's something that they're going to be familiar with because you've taught them how to do it in another subject, or it's something that you've done over and over again in previous science and social studies that they're very familiar with what this looks like. It does require a little bit of training, as well as the understanding from you that what independent work looks like in your classroom. So they could be doing things like reading and responding, watching a video on a topic that is relevant to what you're studying. They could be completing an interactive notebook where they're actually cutting and pasting and assembling and writing things out as their reflection piece in their independent notebook. Or they could be doing either some research and writing as well. So there's lots of things that they can do independently in your classroom doing the flip-flop method. So the question then is, what do you do if they are not independent yet? Well, if they're not independent, it's a matter of training and getting them to be as independent as possible. I always try to remember that independent work does not necessarily mean that students must be silent and they must be not moving or sitting in desks. Independent work looks like quiet, but not silent. I want them engaged in their learning, but that doesn't mean that I have the time to be policing every conversation they have. At some point, I do need to let go and allow them to fail just a little bit, that if they decide not to use their class time wisely, that there is accountability built into what I'm doing so that they can understand that when they are working, they will have to complete this work because I will be following up on the fact that it is. And the consequences of them not really knowing what's happening later are enough that will motivate them to be doing it. It also needs to be as engaging as I need to make it so that they actually are able to engage in it. If they are truly not independent and you are really, really struggling with that, try a different subject matter instead of the flip-flops. So instead of doing the flip-flop method, try open learning where you're pulling in other subject matter to do independently. Perhaps they can't do the science work independently, but perhaps you can try using stuff from another subject such as writing, math, language, or art. Or third, maybe you need to try that teach and work method where each group is working on the same independent activity at the same time with different content. So there's a variety of ways depending on the needs of your students. Another question is, isn't teaching one grade easier? Well, sometimes yes, but other times no. One of the largest challenges that I'm finding this year for the first time having a straight grade is the fact that I am trying to conduct knowledge building circles, or I'm trying to do whole group lessons with 20 kids. And that's a lot different from dealing with 12 kids. Having a conversation with 12 students, more voices get heard. Having a conversation with 20 students, less voices get heard. So it means that I'm not able to have touch points with each student and be able to as easily assess to make sure that more students are involved in the learning. And with a split grade, I actually have more opportunities because I have less students in with me at one time. So it's like I have a very large guided reading group instead of a whole class activity. So cutting my class in half and just dealing with half of my class means I can have I can still have a really engaging conversation, but I actually get to hear more voices in that split grade. So there's definitely some benefits. Secondly, every straight grade is actually a split grade when you look at the amount of individual education plans differentiation that needs to be happening in your classroom. I have yet to be in a class where every student in my class is learning at their assigned grade level. So the reality is that every class, whether it is on paper a split grade or not, is still operating with that split grade mentality. And when do I prep and plan it all? Well, this definitely does take the time. I won't lie to you, planning for a split grade is going to be more work than planning for a straight grade. So that's where I really think the solution is finding resources that are going to allow you to use these variety of methods where you have all of your subject matter covered in a variety of learning strategies. So you have experiments, you have hands-on activities, interactive notebooks, you've got centers, you have read and respond activities. You need to look for things that are specifically designed for split grade teaching for science and social studies. And for madlylearning.com, you can find those on my Teachers Pay Teachers store. I have split grade learning resources that are specifically designed for split grade classrooms. They're planned with a split grade in mind first, and then I do make them available for straight grades. But with planning them in mind for a split grade first, the ability for you to use any of these three strategies of the teach first and then do, whether it is the open learning model or a flip-flop model, all three of those are available because you have a variety of activities to make sure that you can cover both split grades at the same time during the same period. So if you want to find more information about these combined science and social studies grade units, you can find those on www.madlylearning.com/shop store. If you have any questions about my in my split grade inquiry-based resources for science and social studies, feel free to drop a comment here, or you can send me a message on either Facebook, Instagram, or email me at info@madlylearning.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.